Everyone, I think we've got a couple minutes of morning left. Pastor Matt is going to come up and say a few words of welcome.
I'm here.
Thanks.
Yep, you bet. Well, good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to see you. I hope you're enjoying your lunch and snacks and treats here. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Pastor Matt Pensinger, for those of you who didn't see me last month. And I've been senior pastor here at Grace since the beginning of July, so I'm still fairly new. But I wanted to welcome the Historical Society and tell all of you that we're very glad to have you here at Grace Lutheran Church. I hope you enjoy the presentation today.
And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Sam Riley. Sam is a history buff, tireless worker, and president of Union Mills Homestead Foundation. He's also a lawyer in private practice and a retired colonel in the Maryland National Guard. He retired after 30 years of service, which included duty in Iraq. Sam was instrumental in planning and organizing the Homestead's Microbrewery Festival, which has grown into a massive, not-to-be-missed event. This year is scheduled for this coming Saturday, September 24th. Sam started his volunteer service with Union Mills Homestead in high school when he served as a docent. From that time until now, he has played an ever-increasing role in the success of the homestead, which, in addition to the house, superb tannery building and grounds, as a working grist mill. And again, Sam is currently serving as president of the Homestead Foundation. Can we have a very warm round of applause for Mr. Riley? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason, for those very kind words, and I would be I guess remiss if I didn't point out that all those things you talked about at the homestead have very little that are the result of my work. They're the result of a lot of people, and there's a lot of collaboration that happens out there. So pitch to all the homestead members and volunteers who are here today and out there in cyber world if we ever get broadcast. So I guess I'd like to start with a shameless plug for the Historical Society and these BLTs. I'm just, as a member of the Historical Society and as a member of the community, I'm just so impressed with what the Historical Society does in putting on programs. So I just think we have a lot to be proud of as an organization, and the fact they can corral people like me to come up here and speak and pretend that we know something. But anyway, these are a very successful series of programs, so congratulations to the Historical Society. This presentation is really a spin-off of a series of investigations we've been doing out at Union Mills involving our tannery. And we've all known there was a tannery at Union Mills, and we had some good information about it, but with that big grist mill out there with the big moving water wheel, that really gets the center of attention, both in terms of the reaction people get when they come to the site and in terms of the interpretation. And so we launched an investigation in the last few years to expand the interpretation, to get some better knowledge of the tannery. And that investigation really is the source of this presentation and resulted in the focus on the 10 tanneries that we'll be talking about today. I should also point out that this investigation really owes its birth back to a fellow by the name of Chuck Ives, who passed. He died 10 years ago this October, and it was a great loss to the Union Mills Homestead and to a number of different organizations. But Chuck was a real advocate for the tannery and the tanning industry, and had done an incredible amount of research And frankly, none of us realized just how much research he had done. And after his death, and we got all those papers together, we just realized, oh my Lord, this is just an incredible amount of material. The diary entries, all the different writings that he had assembled and research, that has basically served as the basis for a lot of our investigation. And Chuck always took a more holistic, broader view of not just Union Mills and industries at Union Mills, but early industry in Carroll County in general. So, tanneries, you say, so what? Why even talk about tanneries? There are, in Maryland, when we talk about industry, early industry, typically the focus, agricultural industry, the focus is on the transition from tobacco to wheat, and the wheat economy that basically was the driver of Maryland's early economy. And that is the big story. And yes, I guess tanning has maybe a secondary role in that, but it is an important story, tanning is, and it was an important trade because you basically couldn't do anything without leather, whether it was clothes, shoes, harnesses, belts for equipment, you name it. It was a very important industry. And by the 19th century, by the mid-19th century, leather tanning was in the top 5, probably the 5th biggest industry in the country. It was a very large industry, employed a lot of people. So it certainly was an important industry, and you can just see from some of these clippings that, all the amount of different items that were advertised in local papers based on leather. So before we get too far into the presentation, I hate to feel like I'm on a travel presentation talking about what different people have done, but here's a photo that my daughter had taken earlier this year, actually at the Shriver Tannery in Fez, Morocco. And she knew I had an interest in tanneries, so she snapped this picture. I had never even heard of this tannery, but apparently it dates to the 9th century, and still today they tan leather using the same ancient methods that have been used for thousands of years. So the point basically is that this is an ancient trade, leather tanning is, and I guess some of the truth is that by the early 19th century, leather tanning really hadn't changed all that much. The craft of actually turning hides into leather was pretty much the same as it had been for thousands of years. So this brings us to the topic for today, which is the subject of these 10 tanneries. And we certainly knew we had a tannery at Union Mills, but there is this kind of overarching sort of question, well, what other tanneries are out there? What was this industry like overall? And in order to answer that question, I started getting some researchers to look at census data going back in time. And the manufacturing census information is very helpful. It provides a lot of good information about what industries existed and where and what they were actually doing at any given point in time. Now, for any of you who have a particularly small sandwich and don't want to stick around, I'll just get right to the bottom line. They're all gone. So there are no more tanneries. All 10 tanneries are gone. So if you've finished your meal and want to leave, I won't be offended. But that's the main takeaway you get from looking at the census data. And when you look at what happened to these 10 tanneries is that, yes, they disappeared. And when you want to understand census data, you have to look at election districts in Carroll County because all the census data is grouped by election district. This slide is actually a map that was prepared by Jeff Duvall, and it shows the election districts in Frederick County in the 1808 period, essentially unchanged in 1820 census. And if you look at the Westminster area, that particular area going from about the Sawmill up to the Pennsylvania line, Union Mills, that area, that election district just stuck out with the number of tanneries there as opposed to other areas nearby. And so that's where we focused our inquiry. And that's where our story gives us the story of the 10 tanneries. I will make a quick note, not to pat myself on the back, but just to say some of these old census reports are just very hard to read because they're in longhand. And so this particular slide is showing the return of Andrew Pooter's tannery in district number 7 in Frederick County. And this was the easy part, but then when you get into both the questions and the answers, the longhand was sometimes a little challenging to read. And this one told us on the bottom little clip that Andrew Pooter had 25 vats and 1 iron bark mill worked by 1 horse. So, that one little tad bit of information to plug away. So what we did is we went through the 10 tanneries that we found in district number 7 and pulled out all the data into a spreadsheet. And I don't expect you to read all this data, but the bottom line is that it's here, it's available, and it does provide a nice summary of all. This is just 5 of them. I'll show you the next 5. A nice summary of all the different activities that they were doing. There's a lot that they hadn't, that they were doing that was similar. Almost all of them were producing shoe and harness leather. Well, they all were producing shoe and harness leather, and they all had similar type operations. One of these tanners stood out. It was Thomas Pole, because the Thomas Pole Tannery recorded having twice as many vats as any of the other tanning operations, which caught my eye and is actually helpful when we get into the discussion of Thomas Pole a little bit. So this slide shows you the second set of tanners, and the thing that jumped out on this is that Jacob Fisher appeared to have the smallest operation, with the fewest hides consumed and the fewest number of vats at only 16. Again, I hope you're not straining to read these. If anybody would like to see copies of these actual Excels, I can share them with you. It is kind of neat to compare the operations. So the next question that then comes up is, where were these tanneries and why? And that brings us to the geography of tanning leather. Obviously, if you're going to make leather, you need to have animal hides. That's kind of obvious. And you need water. Water is a key part of the process. You also need tannin, which is an astringent that came from typically oak bark in this area, that was mixed with the water to make a tea, essentially, that actually did the tanning. But then 2 other important parts, not to be missed: lime, which we'll talk about in just a moment, and labor. The thing, while this was not the most labor-intensive of industries, in other words, they didn't need a lot of people, it definitely needed somebody to perform the work that went into tanning leather. So labor was a part of it, and it is a component of what led to a successful tanning operation. So when you talk about bark, which is what created this tannin solution, the thing that really you have to keep in mind is that in pre-Columbian North America, there were these massive forests. They were just totally different than anything we can imagine today, and a large proportion of the trees were chestnut and oak, at least in this area. So there was just this incredibly abundant resource that was available to be used not only for building and for all the other early industries that required wood and homes and things like that, but also for bark. The bark was able to be used in tanning. Piedmont, Maryland was just blanketed with these stands of oak trees, and it was a ready source of a resource to be used in the tanning of leather. The second key kind of component of tanning, we talked briefly about lime. One of Carroll County's geologic attributes, as many of you I'm sure know, is the wealth of limestone that's underneath us. Anybody who has a well in Carroll County is probably well aware of that. Not to have too much of a play on words, but our ancestors figured out a long time ago that limestone was a very important item that could be used for a variety of different features. The limestone that came out of the ground, though, didn't really do them much. And they had figured out that in order to use it for all its various purposes, you needed to essentially burn it in a kiln. And that's exactly what they did. And we're able to take the limestone and turn it into, by burning it in the kiln, into calcium oxide, and then when mixed with water, it becomes calcium hydroxide. I never studied all that science, but that's what it does. And of course, limestone and lime became a critical component, not just for tanning, but for whitewash and for cement, mortars, and other purposes, including agriculture. So this image here is actually from the MHT file on the lime kiln right there at Fenby Farm, which is just down the road from Westminster. So we know, and if you look into the old maps, you'll see lime kilns were all over the area in surrounding Westminster. So this was a ready resource that was just sitting there, able to be used for the purposes of those who wanted to tan leather, which brings us to the question of where specifically were these tanneries located. So you hate to be Westminster focused in an organization that talks about all of the county's history, but this story just smacks of Westminster. It is amazing with all the resources that surround the area of Westminster. It's, I guess, not surprising that there were so many tanneries that located here. A 1912 article in the American Sentinel summed it up pretty well, and it's worth reading it verbatim. It said, "Leather has been used by man from the time whereunto the memory of man runneth not to the contrary." Gotta love that quote. And at one time, no hamlet, village, or town in Maryland made more or better leather than Westminster. In the early days of Westminster, the tanning of hides was its principal industry, and the foundation of the modest fortunes of some of its families was made in the business. I might have gotten a word wrong in either reading or transcribing, but it made the point that it was just an important early industry in Carroll County. So let's take a little tour around Westminster and see where some of these tanneries were located. So starting up at Manchester Avenue at the intersection with Manchester Avenue Main Street is where Jacob Yingling was located at 295 East Main Street. And he had a tan yard right next door to his property. Andrew Pooter lived at 286 East Main Street, almost directly across the street from Jacob Yingling, and operated a tannery in the rear of his property. This property, the Pooter property, was lot 28 in the original plat of Westminster. Interesting, right next door to Andrew Pooter was his brother Jacob. And in this image, you can just see this picture of that section of East Main Street, that kind of dilapidated structure. It's all that's left of the Christian Yingling house. That Christian Yingling house was the Pooter home. And what's left is essentially that log structure that was the Jacob Pooter residence in the early 19th century. The Pooters owned quite a bit of land along Green Street in Westminster. It could well have been where the tannery was actually located. Jacob Fisher lived in the vicinity of 254 East Main Street. And anybody who's ever been to a funeral in Westminster is probably aware that this is where Fletcher's is now located. The property was in the family for some time, as William Winchester had sold lots 35 and 36 of his newly platted Westminster in 1778 to the Fisher's father, David Fisher, who was a tanner and maintained a business at that location until his sons took the possession of the property upon his death. Jacob Matthias owned the property at 146 East Main Street, where he operated a tannery. This is the location of the Oddfellows Hall, the Opera House today. Before leaving Main Street, it's worth noting that Francis Shriver, related to some of the other Shrivers we're going to talk about, operated a tannery at the other end of Main Street at 140. Well, he lived at 146 West Main, and starting in 1833, he started a tanning business, which he continued until about 1858. Francis Shriver, of course, is notable as the first mayor of Westminster in the 1850s, and also that civilian who rode along in Corbett's charge and that engagement that we hear about so much in Westminster's history. So heading out of town, Daniel Cover was identified in the 1820 census as operating a tannery in Uniontown, at the far end of town at 3472 Uniontown Road. The census didn't give us that number. That's what the property is identified as today. And interesting, there was also a second tannery that started in Uniontown in the 1840s, started by Charles Devilbiss in what's the middle of town at 3359 Uniontown Road. Jacob Shriver operated a tannery on his father's property along Little Pipe Creek, just down the hill from what is now the Carroll Lutheran Village. Mordecai Haynes operated a tannery in the vicinity of what is now Roops Mill Road and John Hyde Road. The exact location of this one is leaving us a little bit perplexed because the Haynes, while they owned a lot of property, those properties have been so heavily chopped up over the years that there's still some question as to exactly where that tannery was located. That star is basically where the Haynes family cemetery is, where all the Haynes are buried, so it's a fairly good guess. It's in fairly close proximity to that location. By going through the deed indices, we were actually able to find a Haynes deed that shows the transfer of the tannery, but again, getting that deed linked up to current properties is still to be figured out. The 1820 census refers to a David Beals, who is we believe to be David Bale. David Bale grew up at his father's property at the Peter Bale House along Bowersox Road, just southeast of New Windsor. This tannery is also a question mark because there is, as we'll explain just a little bit, there is some complexity surrounding the Bales. There is a known tannery by Abner Bale out along Marston Road, and that could be that's where the star is down here, the Abner Bale property on Marston Road. That could be the property that David Bale was recorded as operating in 1820. And then the Thomas Pole Tannery was located near the intersection of Mail Road and Sam's Creek Road. And of course, Andrew Shriver operated a tannery at Union Mills. So those are the locations of the 10 tanneries, just to give you some geographic idea of where these properties were located. And what I thought it would be kind of a little bit, now we have the location for them, I thought it might be helpful to kind of talk through quickly what each of these tanners, who they were, and what they did, what they achieved. In many ways, these 10 tanners reflect much of Union Mills' 19th century history, Carroll County's 19th century history. There we go. We'll talk about each of these tanners individually, but one thing that jumped out from all of them in looking through their histories was that this really was a family trade. It was almost in every instance passed down from one generation to the next. And that was atypical for many trades, but particularly so in the tanning, in the world of tanning, that each one of these young tanners had learned his craft from his father. Another observation is that each one of these tanners did pretty well, which is surprising. You might think that the tanning of leather was not a very successful worldly pursuit. Only one of these tanners appears to have not done very well, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But that the rest of them were very successful and seem to have been pretty prominent in the community, which is, again, when you start kind of looking at different historic texts, interesting, because William the Conqueror was mocked because his mother was the daughter of a tanner. And you Google that, and it's kind of funny to read these stories. These people had terrible things done to them because they mocked William the Conqueror because of this tanning connection. So it's something that you would have think that maybe this would not be such a prominent job to have, but they seem to be pretty prominent in Carroll County. So Jacob Yingling was one of these multi-generational tanners, and they had a primo location. They had lots 1, 2, and 3 in the original plat of Westminster. His father, John, had purchased that property and operated a tannery at that location and was considered one of Westminster's most prominent citizens. And then Jacob, his oldest son, took over the business, became wealthy in his own right and prominent in Westminster as a tanner, farmer, and merchant. After his death, Jacob Yingling's death, the tannery and property was sold to the Yingling family, and in an interesting little twist, these little details start to jump out at you. One of Jacob Yingling's sons married one of Jacob Shriver's nieces. So it's like, and this is just in almost every instance, you're like, oh my Lord, is this really this intermingled? But it's kind of neat when you start looking at these families are tied together. So Andrew Pooter is an interesting fella. Again, a very diverse crew. Each of them had a different background. The Pooters were French Huguenots who had fled France because of religious discrimination. And it's interesting, most of them spell their name with a U and not a W. The Andrew Pooter line seemed to go with a W spelled powder, but the family pronounces it Pooter. Andrew Pooter lived from 1773 to 1856. There is a little bit of confusion that we realize after I snapped this picture in the Westminster Cemetery that this guy is actually not our Andrew Pooter. This is his nephew. This is Andrew of Jacob, and we're looking for Andrew of Leonard. It gets confusing, but the bottom line is the Pooters grew up on the spinning wheel farm right next to the Shrivers along Little Pipe Creek. So they're all mixed together in a very geographic and a lot of family connections. The Pooters did pretty well for themselves, and they, in 1806, Andrew Pooter and his brother Jacob were on that first committee that were advocating for Carroll County. Well, I guess they didn't have a name for it, and somebody will correct me on this, the name they were advocating back then, but they wanted to form a new county, and they were unsuccessful in that go-round. And then in 1815 and 1816, the Pooters were also members of that group that founded the first bank in Westminster, the Bank of Westminster. So again, you see this prominence in the community, which again, one might be surprised to find with a tanner. Jacob Fisher has a primo burial spot in Westminster Cemetery. If you've ever walked into that cemetery and you walk right in that entrance, it's right there on the left-hand side. You can't miss it. And that kind of makes the point about what prominence he had in his community in that era. Fisher was a third-generation tanner, and his father, David, had purchased 2 of the original lots in Westminster from William Winchester. And again, the Fishers did very well. You may have heard the story of the Bank of Westminster. They often called it Fisher's Bank because of the association of Jacob Fisher's brother, John, who was one of the original directors and was the cashier of the bank for many years. Interesting, these 2 brothers, Jacob and John Fisher, were both longtime bachelors and lived together for many years. And so when you look at the census data, you look at them, living in the house at one point with their sister. So Jacob Matthias, adding to the religious diversity of the crew, was Roman Catholic, and he's got this nice tombstone that can be found in St. John's Cemetery. While it's damaged, you can see it's been broken at one point over time. For its era, it's one of the larger stones in that section of the cemetery. Reflects his prominence in the community. The stone bears a neat inscription over top his name. It says, "Our Father," posted by, I'm sure selected by the children. He operated this tannery that was located where the Oddfellows Hall was located today. And again, he did well and was one of the first presidents of the Farmers and Mechanics Bank of Carroll County, which was chartered in 1850. So again, you see this mix of bankers and tanners in Westminster. So now we come to Daniel Cover. He seems to be a little bit of the black sheep of this group. He had purchased this property in Uniontown in 1807. His father was one of the founders of Uniontown, and they had some degree of prominence, were involved in a lot of land transactions, but something went wrong, and in 1821, the Bank of Westminster foreclosed on the property. The property was then purchased by Moses Shaw and operated as a tannery under two different owners until the mid-1950s. So Jacob Shriver was the youngest son of David Shriver, who was the first Shriver to move into Carroll County and what was then Frederick County. And Jacob Shriver ended up taking ownership of the property along Little Pipe Creek, where that Shriver homestead there is located down the hill from the Carroll Lutheran Village. Jacob Shriver continued his father's tanning and milling business at that location. And it's interesting that Jacob Shriver not only was a third-generation tanner, but upon his death, his son, David H. Shriver, continued operating a tannery at the location there, and so his son would have been a fourth-generation tanner. So Mordecai Haynes is, as I mentioned earlier, has been a little tough to track down. I actually visited the Haynes Cemetery, and while we didn't find Mordecai, we did find one of his sons, Thomas, and several of his sons are there. It gives us a pretty good idea that he is in that cemetery, or at least lived in the vicinity. But there was a tannery operated by Mordecai Haynes, and upon his death, his son Joseph took over the tanning operation in 1835. This family had owned land in the Wakefield area since the 1750s, so they were longtime owners and very prominent in Carroll County. And of interest, Mordecai Haynes in 1812 served on the Frederick County levy court with Andrew Shriver, who was also on the levy court in that same period of time. In that era, the levy court was essentially the county commissioners for Frederick County. And then our fella, David Bale, he's, I mentioned, hard to track down. He is buried, though, in the Bale family cemetery off Bowersox Road. And, you know, this goes on, it's this onion that just keeps unraveling in terms of the family connections. The Thomas Pole Tannery we'll talk about in just a bit. In the 1820 census, they mentioned that Thomas Pole operated that tannery with a man named Jacob Angel. And yet Jacob Angel, I got to see if I can remember all these connections. David Bale's son, Abner, married Fanny Pole, who was Thomas Pole's daughter. So we have this Angel, the Pole, and the Bale Tannery all mixed together. They're mixed by location and they're mixed by family relations. And so while we know where the Abner Bale Tannery is located and we know where the Thomas Pole Tannery is located, you know, it's possible here that David Bale was operating the tannery in the 1820 period. Maybe he didn't own it, but he was the operator in that particular period. So that brings us to Thomas Pole. And again, this is an interesting tannery to look at because one, it was a very large tanning operation. But due to the hard work of Jeff Duvall, we've pulled up the entire inventory of his estate. And it's fascinating. So he died in 1821, and he left a lot of stuff. He didn't. Maybe he wasn't expecting to die so soon. But when you look at that inventory, now we'll talk about Andrew first. That's right. The inventory is coming up on the next slide. The inventory is fascinating. Andrew Shriver is buried right next to his brother Jacob along Little Pipe Creek, and Andrew, like his brother, was a third-generation tanner. And unlike the rest of these tanners, Andrew Shriver had a totally different business plan. He wasn't planning on operating a tannery in its own right to make money. He operated his business anchored around a grist mill. And his idea was to have a grist mill that was going to be very successful, and he assembled a whole host of various supporting trades around it in a kind of a vertically integrated operation that was very successful. And that was kind of the magic of Andrew Shriver's concept. When Andrew Shriver died, his son, Andrew Kaiser Shriver, A.K. Shriver, took over the tanning of leather at that site, at Union Mills. And then the A.K. Shriver and Sons Tannery stayed in business on through the latter part of the 19th century. So that means that A.K. Shriver and his sons were the fourth and fifth generations of that family to operate a tannery in the New World. Just fascinating, again, these multi-generational histories in tanning. So I know you can't see this, and I don't expect you to, but it is pretty nifty when you look at this inventory. I did go through it and pulled some of the items out that I thought were interesting to highlight. It goes in this inventory, and this is just a portion of the inventory, it goes vat by vat, letting you know what was in each vat at the time the inventory was done. And just some of the highlights, it says that in vat number 8, there were 14 slaughter hides in the second layer, intended for upper leather at $3.50 a piece. There were 2 horse hides at $1.50 each, and there were 13 calf skins at $1.15 each. In vat number 10, there were 24 Spanish hides for sole leather at $1.68 each. 1 slaughter hide, 2 hog skins at only $1 each. And each of these, again, vats goes through and it specifies all the content. It's just a fascinating insight on how this tannery was operated in that era. And then you look at the list of tools. On the right-hand side, it lists a bunch of stuff that he used in his tanning operation, and it's just a whole bunch of stuff, but some of them are worth highlighting. There were 6 gallons of fish oil, probably used in the finishing of leather, 4 currying knives, 2 fleshers, 6 brushes, 1 sponge, 2 scouring stones, 1 currying beam, 1 wheelbarrow, and 1 bark knife, along with a bunch of other stuff. But in any event, I mean, what a just incredible resource that inventory is in terms of how this tannery was operated. So it's worth making a point that we know that these tanners couldn't tan leather by themselves. Labor was an incredibly important part of the story, and as with all of the various industries that were operated in Carroll County, there was a variety of different sources of labor, including families, apprentices, and in some instances in Frederick County, enslaved labor. This is an interesting little bit that Mimi Ashcraft pulled out of the apprentice records, showing that Daniel Cover, in just a few periods, this is just one snippet of the apprentice records, had a series of apprentices in the period from 1809 to 1813. At least one of those appears to have been a relative. Well, actually, several of them were relatives, and several of them were neighbors. So again, it's just interesting to see that there was the Daniel Cover made use of apprentice in his tanning of leather. And I mentioned the Francis Shriver Tannery. We know that tannery that was operated by Francis Shriver in Westminster, that Francis had actually been apprenticed to Andrew Shriver in the years before he operated his tanning. So, his tannery. So he went out, learned the trade, and then moved up, and at the point he had enough resources and knowledge to open his own business. So I'm not going to talk in detail about the tanning of leather. I don't have that much time. But it's worth pointing out that that there is a multi-step process in tanning, and the bottom line to this whole point of all these steps is that the bulk of tanning happened in vats, underground. And that's one of the things that we found in our work at Union Mills, is that one of the reasons that you just don't see much about tanneries anymore is that they're all gone. The buildings were somewhat ephemeral, they got knocked down, became garages, whatever. The tanning vats, which is where the bulk of the work was done, were underground. So this diagram we pulled from an 1890 treatise on tanning, and it shows you how a tannery might be arranged. It shows the various portions of the tannery, where the bark sheds were, where the beam house was, and where the vats were. This kind of research was very helpful for us at Union Mills when we were trying to figure out tanning of leather at Union Mills, and served for some of the background that led us to our researchers to the conclusions as to what structures actually existed at Union Mills, and where they were and what were the purposes. Now, we had the benefit not only of all this research that we had done and diaries and letters, we also have a wealth of photographs, and I'll show you one of those in just a moment. We also know that there was a smokestack, and we have that wonderful image of the smokestack at Union Mills, and I think I'll actually show you that too. So bottom line is the vat enclosures were in the center of the tannery, and they were surrounded by things such as the bark sheds and the beam house, where a lot of the preparation work was done. Here's an image of the Union Mills tannery that shows you the kind of names for various functional areas of the tannery, and again, this gives you some idea of how a tannery might be operated. And then here's this wonderful image from the 1877 atlas showing the Shriver Tannery with that big smokestack. So the Shriver Tannery, unlike many of the other smaller tanneries, had actually made the jump from human and animal labor to steam power in the operation of their tannery, and were doing pretty well, but as we'll go through in just a moment, they just weren't doing well enough to be able to survive into the 20th century. I mentioned the underground tanning vats. It's just worth mentioning that all those vats were typically connected with something. And you see all these ads in the old shoe and leather reporters for wooden pipes that were used to connect all these tanning vats. And most of the excavation that has been done, archaeological work at tanning sites, in fact, have found just that, all in a wealthy array of tanning vats connected with wooden pipes, which serves as an incredible resource for archaeologists. And of course, there's all kinds of good stuff that gets left over in tanning pipes, including animal hides and hair pieces and so forth. Just briefly on the Union Mills investigation, because I figured somebody was going to ask me that, so I just threw up a quick slide just to say that we've been through 3 phases of work at Union Mills, including some intensive historical research, a phase 1A where they walked the ground, and an actual dig. We've actually done a dig where they've looked at and found one tanning vat at Union Mills, which is pretty nifty. And then, again, I figured somebody would ask me this. The next steps at Union Mills are going to be a continued archival research, because we know we have just a wealth of stuff that needs to be figured out. We have a lot of resources that still need to be digitized, and then ultimately we need to do some site master planning to see kind of what's next in the Union Mills story in terms of, do we do more archaeology, what do we do? So this is a larger story, of course. There are more than 10 tanneries, we know that, and we know they're all gone. So I did do some more broader survey work on the census information, and I thought it was worth pointing out that this is just one of the examples. This is the 1850 Maryland manufacturers inventory, and when you look at the census data for 1850 for Carroll County, you can see that there were 20 tanneries in Carroll County in 1850, and it's interesting, you look at this, it's second only to flour milling as an industry here in Carroll County in 1850. In the 1860 census, you can see that there were only 9 tanneries listed in Carroll County. There were 93 total in Maryland, and what's fascinating to me is that other than the 17 that were located in Baltimore City, the rest of the tanneries in Maryland were all located along the Pennsylvania line, and those counties adjoining the Pennsylvania line. There were no tanneries located in any of the states farther south in Maryland, where of course they probably didn't have as much bark and didn't have all the other resources that we have up in the northern part of the state. So here is a little chart of the Carroll County tannery census information I could pull up in my research, and you get the idea that 1840 was probably the heyday for tanning in Carroll County, and by 1880 it was down to 10. And I should say it was downhill from there. This is a really cool chart. We were able to go through all the Maryland tannery census data for a century. So from 1850 to 1940. And you can see that the Maryland chart, it's just a precipitous drop from a high of 116 Maryland tanneries in 1850 to 2 in just 1940. And of course, none in Carroll County today, or rather none in Maryland today. And I should say that this story doesn't even tell the full story, because it's interesting, as time went on and there got to be fewer and fewer tanneries, they started combining not just tanneries but couriers in the same blocks of information. So if you look strictly at tanneries, it's probably an even more precipitous drop in the last 30 years. So what happened to all these tanneries? I mean, that's certainly a great question to ask. I mean, certainly we know that, I mean, if you want to look at some of the easy things you can point at, tanneries stink. It's kind of neat. You look in Lou Shriver's diary in April of 1873, he complained about guests at the tan yard who held their nose on account of the bait smell. Delicate people. The baiting process was done after liming and typically involved manure. They would use chicken manure or something like that. Sometimes they use dog dung, but the idea, and typically what you do is you'd ferment it so it would get good and potent, and that had some chemical process that stopped some of the chemicals in the liming. So tanning was also dangerous, and Lou Shriver records in numerous instances in his diary where he would run a roller over top a thumb or over a finger. He had numerous injuries that he recorded. There's an interesting bit in his diary where he records in 1876 that 2 or 3 days ago we missed our little dog Spinny. Today we found her in the bottom of a vat, dead of course. We have had her some 7 or 8 years and became very much attached to her, and accordingly took the loss pretty hard. And that's not the only kind of tragedy that happened in connection with tanneries. In the Beale Tannery up in Keymar, fascinating little story recorded that Mr. Beale had a 3-year-old son, James Beale, who fell into a vat and drowned, whereupon the tannery was closed in 1875. So you have those reasons, and of course there's the question of the deplenished resources. By the late 19th century, bark was hard to find in Carroll County. There was decreasing, many of these stands of oak were gone, and of course the demand for hides well exceeded what you could get locally. So hides were being shipped in from all over the country and even from outside the country. So those were all good reasons. But frankly, more so than even that were some of the efficiencies that came with rapid industrialization. Another complaint tanners had was the rise of the idea of commission merchants. Basically, these folks, and the complaint was, city folks were controlling the country folks, but the tanners, because they didn't have enough hides, would have to buy their hides from a commission merchant. So you'd buy your hides at one price, salted, you would tan them and you'd sell them back to the exact same commission merchant at a different price. And so literally it was that you were at the mercy of these city merchants who were controlling the market. Larrabee and DeFord are two, you'll see these two names in this, if you can see that closely, but these were two of the commission merchants that were in Baltimore. And we know that the Shrivers bought quite a bit of their hides and sold back a lot of their hides to the DeFords. So this was an example of just all the different commission merchants that were advertising in the late 19th century. Another big issue, technology was changing. All those traditional methods of tanning and finishing leather were changing. There were so many different ads. You look in the Shoe and Leather Reporter, it's chock full. Save time and money. And it has all these gizmos that you can invest to become a more efficient tanning operation. So rapid industrialization really was changing, and there are all sorts of inventions that were coming along. Here you see that a big roller machine. Many tanning operations couldn't make that investment. The Shrivers did invest in rolling machines. We know that because Lou nearly lost a thumb a couple times in one. But these were big pieces of equipment that cost money. One of the other things that changed was the process of tanning leather. For years, they had used this vegetable process, vegetable tanning based with using oak bark, and it took a long time. A tanning of a hide could take up to a year using traditional methods. And in the late 1800s, along came this idea of using chromium, and it dramatically changed the tanning of leather and made it into a much more efficient process. Obviously, then created some environmental issues that arose as well. But the biggest thing that happened, probably the biggest thing that changed the tanning of leather, was the rise of big corporate ownership, big corporate-owned tanning operations, including the United States Leather Company. Interesting, the last tanning operation in Carroll County was the Carroll Oak Tanning operation over at Tannery. That operation, by 1880, was already sold to an out-of-state business, and that tanning operation stayed operating until the 1920s. But during that entire period of time, it was no longer locally owned. But in the early 1900s, it had a shot. At least this operation over at Tannery. This is over on the east side of Westminster, because it was not only located near labor and near a good source of the water, but it was located right on the railroad, which was important. There are, actually, before I tell you the rest of the story, I should read one thing that, if I can find it. It's just a great quote about the complaints in 1912 about the what happened to tanning in Carroll County. And this was out of a local newspaper. It said, in the onward march of business, with its combination of capital, this branch of industry was squeezed out of our community and out of every community in the country. Beside this line of business, wagon making, blacksmithing, shoemaking, harness making, and a host of other useful branches of business have been forced out of existence by and this is the plug I guess this writer was trying to make, by the huge trusts and monopolies which have for some time flourished in this country. So, that was certainly the trust-busting era, and there were a lot of concerns about the growth of large corporate interest. But there certainly is a lot of truth to that, because to rapid industrialization really did require the level of investment and the level of corporate ownership reflected in some of these business operations. So, and that brings us, I guess, to the rest of the story. I should add that I heard that very nice welcome about being associated with Union Mills since I was in high school. Yes, I was, and I walked that ground for years. I had no idea there was a tannery under my feet, and it's just amazing how many ways and how many different connections tanning has, not just to me personally, but to all of us. And I think through the fact that I worked for a summer, not just at Union Mills, I worked for a summer with Jim Davis on East Main Street in Westminster. I never knew that there were all these tanneries surrounding that business. Every day I parked there, all these tanneries are right there, and I never knew it. But there are many other interesting little twists and turns of the tanning business. For instance, the Oddfellows Hall, where Jacob Matthias's tanning operation was, that Oddfellows Hall, think of all the history that went through that place, including an 1870 speech there by Frederick Douglass. Just so many different twists and turns with these stories, and then the way they still are affecting us today in our everyday lives. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this scene in the Shriver Wainwright Room, the library at the Carroll County Historical Society, Carroll County. This lovely mantle and the cupboard to its left were from the Yingling Reese Blizzard House down at 295 East Main Street. And after the Yinglings sold the property, and the property was kind of improved with that Second Empire look, this lovely old mantle came off and was put into storage, and then was in 1978 donated to the Historical Society. So each and every time you go into the Historical Society, you get to sit there and enjoy this lovely mantle from Jacob Yingling's home. And I should add, in this, if you enjoy these old photographs, this is an old image of the Shellman House, of course, and then this house is yet another reminder of how tanners impact us in our history and the spaces that we still occupy today. From 1842 until 1863, this was the Fisher home. And what's kind of neat about it is that, again, these two men were bachelors, and they lived together. The 1850 census has Jacob and John and their sister living in this home. And then in 1856, the brother John, the banker, ended up getting married, and the rest of the family moved out, I guess, to provide the newlyweds a little bit of privacy. Again, these stories go on, and I won't belabor it. I guess the bottom line is to tell you that our 10 tanners did pretty well. They established a legacy for their family. They were very successful, and while on the one hand they did well, and they maybe started tanning at a good time for them because of the money they made, in the big picture, they actually started tanning at a pretty bad time. If you think of the generations of tanners who passed that trade down from one generation to the next, the tanners in Carroll County in the 1800s, I don't think had any idea what was coming. And again, this neighborhood craft industry that existed for generations, that produced for personal or local consumption using locally produced or generated slaughter hides, it had been that way as long as humans could remember. And then all of a sudden, we have this just incredible change happening in the 20th century that no longer was the trade being passed down from one generation to the next, but instead, this craft industry had become a national industry, and local tanners simply couldn't compete. So to get to those of you who had a bigger sandwich, now you stuck for the whole story. Now you know why there are no more of those 10 tanners. So that's my story. I apologize if I wandered a little bit. There's so much research still to be done on this, and there's a lot more, I guess, to draw from it, and I welcome any questions you might have.
Thank you, Sam. We have some microphones here. If you could raise your hand, I'll be happy to pass you the mic if you have a question. And then there's a button on the bottom there that you have to hold for a moment.
See if this.
Yeah. I wonder how many people here are wearing leather shoes?
my uppers are leather, not my soles. I will add, because you actually stole one of my little props, I was trying to move quickly so I didn't get bogged down too much, but I do have a leather sole from a tannery visit we made a couple years ago. A tannery was being torn down and we went through and all grabbed a leather sole. So I have one sitting here if you want to see it.
Just wondering what connection the Ladies processing had connected with the tanneries. Lottie used to pick up the dead animals from a lot of the farms in the area.
I don't know. You know, it's I know that we always thought that was when those hides went to glue. I don't think that, certainly in our area, those hides were being turned into into tanned leather. Perhaps they were going to some processing center somewhere in the city. I don't know. That's a great question.
Here you go, Melva.
In the earlier years,
I was just wondering, what would the vats have been made of?
So the vats were made of wood. They were basically prefabbed wooden crates. You dug a hole, you stuck the vat in the ground, and you packed it with clay and then soil, and so they were wood, and that's what we found. We're gonna have another program at some point on our actual archaeological work at Union Mills, and we'll go into some of that in more detail, but they were made of wood.
So when they finished with them, you just filled in the dirt?
You put the hides in, you pour the water in, and the hides literally sat in the vats of water of this tea, this tannin tea.
in the earlier years of tannery, did the tanners run their own butcher shops, or where did they get their hides from?
So again, in the early days, when hides were being generated locally through the local, in your local community, you either got them from your own butchering operations or from the local slaughterhouse. Over time, in the 19th century, anyone who's read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and have some sense of the incredible changes that happened in meat packing, that story, the story of meat packing and the centralization of the slaughtering of animals at the turn of the 20th century, that's the kind of the flip side of the coin in making leather, because you need hides to make leather, and tanners will tell you that leather is the ultimate renewable resource, and that you're recycling these hides, and so they're not going to waste. But that is a big part of the story, is that the hides were being produced in these massive slaughterhouses and then were being shipped all over the country for tanning.
Sam, that question was about raw material. I'm at the other end of the manufacturing cycle with the finished product. Obviously, some of the hides were used by local shoemakers, harness makers, and craftsmen. Do you have any evidence of where the finished product was sold? Was this a lot shipped to Baltimore for outsourcing to other manufacturers?
So we've gotten a lot of information on that, actually almost too much. Certainly in the latter part of the 19th century, at least at the Shriver Tannery at Union Mills, the hides were going to leather merchants. In the early days, I haven't seen these documents, but the tradition is, and apparently it's in the record somewhere. I mean, one of the challenges we have at Union Mills is there's just so much. There's just more than you can possibly imagine in terms of the paper record that was preserved. But in the early days, Andrew Shriver was believed to have sold his hides to places such as West Point. The U.S. military was a big consumer of leather for harnesses and saddles and so forth. But that's a great question, and research still to be done. And I should say, just for a shout out, Your Honor, that I appreciate the research you did on the tanneries in the Manchester area, but ultimately they didn't make it into my presentation, or I'd be here for another hour.
Something that might help that lady. My great-grandfather was John Christian Stalford, and supposedly had a tannery somewhere between Hampstead and Manchester, and during World War I supplied the leather for the shoe soles to the U.S. Navy. and I wondered if you had any information about that.
What's the last name?
Stalfort, Stalfort.
You know, so I do have a series of backup slides.
Post-Civil War era.
So we've gone through in great detail, as much as we pulled out through the 1877 and the Martinet maps, the tanneries we could locate, and I have an Excel spreadsheet with a lot of tanners on it. I don't recognize that name, but one of the challenges with tanning operations, and the same thing with mills, is that often they would use the tanner's name for the tannery. Sometimes they would use the owner's name for the tannery. So it's very possible that one of these tanneries on our list was that exact tanning operation. And I do have backup slides if you'd like to come up here afterwards. And I've got all these tanneries in that area, in the Manchester and Hampstead area, on my slide farther in. If you want to look through and see if you can figure out which one it might be.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Oh, here, Diane.
At first, when you were talking, I thought in the early days that Westminster was probably a pretty stinky town. But then I thought, well, wouldn't you want to be a neighbor? And then you said the neighbors quite often worked for the tan yard, so that helped that. So then I just wondered, as the years went by and things started to fall apart, what happened to the vats? Or can you go into Westminster and start digging a hole and actually find some of these?
So I love that question, because that actually was the premise. That question actually was the premise for all the archaeological work we did at Union Mills. The assumption is, in almost all instances, humans will take the path of least resistance, and if you have a hole, you just dump junk into it and you move on. It's unlikely, at least in concept, that anybody was going to dig up this wooden superstructure and haul it out of the ground. And what we have verified at Union Mills is that's in fact exactly what happened, because the tanning vat that we found was full of fill, just stuff that they just needed to get rid of. It went into the hole, covered it up, and then off they went and did something different with the property. So yes, there's all these properties, to the extent they haven't been excavated, probably have tanning vats underground somewhere.
There's a question right there. I've got one here, Lynn.
What are the rough dimensions of a tanning vat? I imagine they were varying sizes, or?
So the question was about the dimensions of a tanning vat. They varied, and I could have gone on forever. I actually have photographs from some modern tanneries that amazingly are very similar to the ancient ones, but rough approximation, maybe 5 feet by 10 feet, something like that. They differed, and if you look at old wood cuttings from like the medieval time, they were round. I mean, typically they were different, and they weren't always underground. Sometimes they were above ground. It depended on the size of the operation. All good questions, and I'm sure you could ask questions all day. I will thank you as an audience. I felt this had the risk of being tedious, but there's some big takeaways from the story, and sometimes it helps to understand some of that granularity to get the bigger picture. And so each and every one of these tanners has a story, and it's a story that I'm sure will continue to be told. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, very much for the presentation, and thanks for the shout out to Honorable Judge Joe Getty. And we're happy that you're here, Judge. And thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you next month. And what a great crowd, great topic. Sam, thanks again.